Well, this evening for our class, we're going to look at the biblical view of Christian ethics. We're going to begin by turning in our Bibles to the book of Exodus, chapter number 20. Exodus, chapter 20. And we have the account given by Moses of the giving of the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments, beginning with Exodus chapter number 20 and verse 3. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And let me just say that one of the reasons why these commandments were given was to differentiate between the requirements of a holy God, Jehovah, and the type of culture, the type of people that he wanted to lead and to have at his disposal, to make a difference between them and the pagans which occupied the land of Canaan. They had many different gods. They were polytheistic in their beliefs, as were the Egyptians. And so now God is bringing people into this land of promise, and he is saying to them, I want you to know only one God, Jehovah. And I don't want you to practice the things that are associated with a polytheistic culture, whereby you had a God of nature, and you had a God that was concerned with birth, and you had a God concerned with reproduction, and a God of agriculture, and on it go. Innumerable numbers of different gods. In Canaan specifically, there was the fertility cult of Baal, and then you had the goddess Ashtoreth, and there were some other gods. You had Chemosh, and you had Moloch. Basically, all of them were pagan deities that were in some way demanded not only the allegiance of the people, but in many instances required them to give their children as well as human sacrifices. So the commandments were designed to give guidelines as to how God expected his people to conduct themselves towards him, as well as how they should relate to each other. Keep in mind that the first 4 of the 10 are all directed at man's relationship with his God. And then the last 6 are concerned about man-to-man relationship among neighbors, relationship among family members, all related to human connection, the last 6. But in the first commandment, we see the exclusion of all other gods as persons or objects of worship. Number 2, which is in Exodus 20 verse 4, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. All right, so now a graven image, of course, is a representation of a deity. And the pagans had many different graven images. They had statues, they had idols, they had inscriptions, which they all attributed to have godlike powers, and they worship these things. Again, God is making a differentiation between how he should be worshipped and how the pagans worship. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the 3rd and the 4th generation of them that hate me. And so here we see the introduction now of a clause within this commandment, this second commandment, whereby he says, you are not only should you not have any graven images made unto yourself, but you're not supposed to bow down to them and serve them, because your God, the true God, is a jealous God. He doesn't want to share his worship with other deities. at any time or in any place. Israel was considered to be the wife of Jehovah, and he did not wish to share his wife with other gods or goddesses. And there is the promise of the curse visiting the iniquity, the sin of serving, bowing down to other gods. That curse would then be transferred onto the children, grandchildren, and even the great-grandchildren, to them that hate me. Goes on to say, he will show mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Verse number 7, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. And this, of course, refers to using God's name in ways that will not honor him. If God's name is to be used in a sentence, it is to be held in reverence, honor. Then verse 8 introduces the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant or thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So it goes back to the creation week. And here we see very clearly that the Bible teaches 6-day creation, not 6 eons or 6 ages, but 6 literal days. And the seventh day was be the Sabbath, and it was to be a day of rest. God instituted it as a day of rest. Number 12, or verse 12, introduces now the first commandment with promise. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days, this is the promise, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. And so the honoring of one parent was something that was very, very important to God, because he, as the ultimate authority, understood that young people needed to have good leadership over them from the home, to guide them in life and to keep them moving in the right direction, to give them instruction. Mainly, a parent's job is to give instruction to his children, especially the father. The mother also has a role in that, but the dad's role is to give instruction to his children, discipline them when they need it. And of course, both the father and the mother are to love the children unconditionally. Then we get into commandment number 6, which is thou shalt not kill. And we are to understand that commandment to mean not to murder. Premeditated homicide is what God had in mind with this commandment, which was reiterated by Jesus in the Gospels. Because God never said you could not kill, because he authorized wars, he authorized all kinds of attacks against enemies of Israel and his own personal enemies. He killed them. He vanquished and killed Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea. So God is not against all killing. And he's not against taking the life of a murderer, for example. Genesis 9:6 tells us that after the flood and that new dispensation started, which they call the dispensation of human government, God said it is okay that if a man takes another man's life, sheds his blood, it is okay that by man shall his blood be shed, for he was made in the image and likeness of God. And so that commandment to use the government to execute justice against criminals, that is also part of the Decalogue, and it's part of having a society that has order whereby the rule of law is respected. Verse 14, Exodus 20, thou shalt not commit adultery. And of course the Canaanites, the Egyptians, and these other cultures were rather promiscuous and did not see anything wrong with having relations with other men's wives, other men's spouses. There was no reverence for the home. And so God, in order to establish this reverence that one should have for marriage, for one's spouse, he instituted, thou shalt not commit adultery. Moral, ethical society respects marriage and knows that it originated with God. God himself is the originator of marriage. Satan has worked hard to seek to undo marriage and discredit marriage and defile marriage, and he has succeeded in many ways in our modern culture because of the promiscuity of the mindset of many in our culture. But it doesn't change the fact that it is still an immoral thing for a man or a woman to step outside of their marriage to seek sexual gratification. It is still against the law of God, and so that was included in the commandments. Again, we're talking about separating and making a difference between a holy people and unholy people. Thou shalt not steal is commandment number 8, and obviously that is instituted to protect private property, as God believes in the ownership of property, and that needs to be respected. It's amazing that if one were to go to a culture deep into the jungles of Africa or the jungles of the South Pacific or wherever, you find a culture that is not influenced by Western civilization. Even in those cultures that are not Western civilization cultures, you're going to find that there is this desire to protect private property and to respect private property. And so thou shalt not steal actually is something that needs to be included there. Then thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. That means that if you have some sort of a declaration to make, it better be the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Because to bear false witness is, of course, lying, is deception, is slander. It could cause a person to suffer in the community. It could damage a person's name. And God is against false witnesses. Remember that Christ himself suffered because of false witnesses that were paid to slander his name. And then the final of the 10 commandments is, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant. Now that's really interesting, because let's say a person has been blessed, is wealthy, and has an employee that is doing tremendous work, and his neighbor's lawn keeper, or his neighbor's maid, or his neighbor's chauffeur, or whatever it is that person is being employed, is not nearly as efficient as your neighbor. This is said, you're not to go and covet. You ought not to envy your neighbor because his employees are better than yours. You ought to do some kind of training program for your employees to get them better, but don't go ahead and hate your neighbor because he has better workers under him than you do. All right, so it also talks about not coveting a person's ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor. So it covers all manner of property, houses and cars, and even one's assets, one's relationship with their kids. I've seen people envy other people because their kids are doing well in school and and the other people's kids are not doing so well, and so there is this envy because one family is doing better than the other, and these things ought not to be. What you ought to do is learn what is your neighbor doing, what principles your neighbor is applying to make his family work better than yours, if that's the case. But there ought not be this covetous mentality. So these things were instituted to help the nation of Israel live and to prosper. They prospered as they kept these commandments. And then there were some other ordinances and ceremonial laws which originated from these. But as they kept these commandments, all their heart, soul, and mind, God prospered them. God preserved them wherever they went. God protected them. And God promoted them. And the idea was to have a nation that would exalt the one true God and show the whole world what the one true God was like. And thus, in doing this, he would, in fact, discredit all of the pagan gods and goddesses